So in this video we talk about science in the Middle Ages, and we mean more or less the 1,000 years from the end of Rome, roughly 400 AD, to 1400 with the beginning of the Renaissance. So that's 1,000 years. Now, was there any development of science in those 1,000 years? Yes, of course there was. In various places, there were people who wrote about specific phenomena in the world that we live in, building on the Greeks. So if they knew Greek, if they read Greek, and they could read Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and others, then they added to that. So a very great geographer in Egypt in the 100s, he is going to invent latitude and longitude, and that will be important all through the Middle Ages. His name is Ptolemy, Ptolemy. And then in the various Islamic countries, Iraq, Iran, Syria, there was great progress, scientific progress in Baghdad until the terrible Mongol invasions of 1258. But in Spain, there was scientific progress, and that progress was shared with France and Britain and other visitors to Spain who learned Arabic, Hebrew, and then translated works that came from the Islamic tradition. So what happens then after the fall of Rome? We're all aware that the ancient world, the ancient Greek world, and Jewish for that matter, come to a sort of crash at 100, 200, or 300, somewhere in there during the Roman period. And then in 400, the Roman Empire collapses. Augustine lives in 430, so clearly he sees the collapse, and he does. And he writes books about what he's seeing. One of them is called The City of God, where he describes the entire world and what's happening. And he and his friends, Ambrose in Milan and Jerome in Jerusalem, was working on a Latin Bible, and it will come out and be the Latin Bible for the next 1,000 years. All three of them are in agreement that they have to figure out what to do about Greek science and the ancient Jewish Bible. So what do they decide? Well, they decide that the two can be brought together. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? You all know. Their answer was everything. So they will work now at 400 to try to begin to bring those two traditions together. What's happening around them? Invasion, barbarians, chaos, Vandals, Goths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Huns, Franks, Saxons, Angles, Jutes, on and on and on. Everywhere you turn, chaos, confusion. Constantine is ruling in the east. He builds the city of Constantinople. Edict of Milan in 313 allows Christianity to exist. Important thing for us about the Middle Ages is that in this period, ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Greek mathematics, geometry survives. They survive by being carried through a number of different roads to the Renaissance. One is through Constantinople. One is through Baghdad and medieval Iraq, Islamic Iraq, Toledo in Islamic Spain, and later, finally, in the Renaissance to Florence. How do these ideas get to the modern world? Well, one of them is through monasticism. And so during the 500s, all over Europe, in all these different locations, the monks are copying books, saving books, praying, working in the fields, and studying and building libraries. All around them, south, north, there are more invasions, Islamic invasions in the 600s. But with all this happening, the ancient Greek knowledge survives. One place it survives is in Constantinople, and it will survive there to 1453. So it'll be a Greek Christian city all the way from Constantine to 1453. All right, so that's one way. The things that are there have to be taken out before 1453 because it's 1453 that the Islamic invasion finally takes over Constantinople, and then the Greek works are lost, the libraries are destroyed, so it has to be between 1453. But there was another road. That road led from Greece, from Athens and Thebes and Sparta, through Constantinople, and then into present-day Iran and Iraq, because a whole series of Greek scholars went into Iraq and Iran, settled down, translated the books into Arabic, and so those books ended up in Baghdad in a great library during what was called the Islamic Golden Age, 1000, 9 and 1000, and so a lot of Aristotle and Plato are in libraries in Islam, translated into Arabic, carried all the way to Spain. The House of Wisdom was the great library and center in Baghdad. There it is. There's a picture of the House of Wisdom, which survives to about 1000. But, very important point about science and how it gets to the modern world. In 1111, around 1100, this man, Al-Ghazali, you should know his name, A-L-Ghazali, he writes a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And Al-Ghazali, who is the most influential Islamic philosopher after Muhammad himself. And what did Al-Ghazali say? He said, let's not study the Greeks anymore. We don't need them. And Al-Ghazali's power is so great that he shuts it down. All over the Islamic world, Al-Ghazali's books prevail. And so, even in Spain, which had this extremely advanced, brilliant center of Islamic studies of Greek philosophers like Aristotle, the Islamic authorities shut it all down. So some of the most famous Islamic scholars like Averroes has to leave Spain because of Al-Ghazali and the ideas of Islamic scholars. In Baghdad, the final destruction takes place in 1258. So Mongols invade Europe, and when they do, they completely destroy Baghdad, and they completely destroy the Baghdad library. All the books are thrown in the river, and it's all destroyed. So, by 1258, even if the Islamic authorities had recommended that their people study Aristotle and Plato, they weren't doing it, and then they can't do it. So, by 1100, the whole Islamic East, the road through Baghdad, was blocked, and now Christian Europe would have to retrieve Greek science on its own, in its own way, and you all know how they do it. Florence, Renaissance Florence. But during this long journey back, as the great Greek books, Aristotle and Plato, are found and brought back piece by piece by piece in certain cities, like Bologna, like the University of Bologna. Here is the expert on law. In this period now, 1000, 1100, 1200, 1300, the time of Dante, and finally Renaissance in 1400, the traditional books have told you that nothing happened in medieval science. The traditional way to teach the state of science in the Middle Ages, and that's our subject now, is to say, as this professor did, William Dampier, that the scientific thought was foreign to the prevailing mental outlook of all medieval philosophers, who were enmeshed in a tangle of astrology, alchemy, magic, and theosophy, totally hostile to experimental science. Now, I put that up there to point out to you how even a 20th century, 21st century expert talks about medieval science. That opinion is 100% false. The Middle Ages were not hostile to science. Some of the greatest scientific advances are going to take place in the Middle Ages, and I'm going to tell you who they are right this minute. But the reason this is important is we want to realize that the journey from Aristotle and Plato and Moses comes all the way through, unbroken, through all the Middle Ages, piece by piece by piece, and with the addition of Florence and Renaissance, so that by 1600, London, Paris have a complete control of ancient Greek science. That I want you to understand that it's a continuous tradition. The idea that in the Middle Ages all of European science stopped dead is not true. And it's particularly not true if you're being told, as you will be told in lots of recent books, that all of modern science really was revived by Islam. That it was the Islamic tradition through Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba, that Europe learned ancient science. Nonsense. Total, ridiculous nonsense. There is a break in Islamic science at a certain point, and it can't go past that break. So it is perfectly true that in 8 and 900, Islamic science is the most advanced in the Western world, European world, Middle Eastern world, no question about it. But it doesn't continue, and it doesn't continue up to 1500 or 1600. It's interrupted. So the truth is, as R.W. Southern says in his great, great book on the Middle Ages, regarded simply as an effort to comprehend the structure of the universe, to demonstrate the dignity of the human mind by showing that it can know all things, this body, meaning all the philosophers in the Middle Ages, is one of the most ambitious displays of scientific humanism ever attempted. When he says scientific humanism, he means scientific understanding of the universe and scientific studies about the human. So that's what he means. Given this commitment to the pursuit of knowledge, Christian theology and natural philosophy were closely. Now, natural philosophy was the medieval word for science. So they had theology and they had natural philosophy, and natural philosophy was what we would call the sciences. Edward Grant says, within Western Christianity in the late Middle Ages, almost all professional theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, were also natural philosophers or scientists thinking about scientific things. The structure of medieval university education also made it likely that most theologians had early careers actually taught natural philosophy, meaning scientific subjects. So what we have then, all the way through the Middle Ages, and we can define it broadly, Augustine to the Renaissance, so 400 to 1400, that's how I look at the Middle Age, 1,000 years, 400 to 1400. If we look at that period, the medieval university education is a continuation of the ancient classical education, but it's in Latin. That's the key thing. Remember, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance in Florence, all of Western education is in Latin from Rome. One great Roman, writing in 585, defined a medieval education. The trivium and the quadrivium told him exactly what to study, how to study it. There he is with his books. And all of the medieval education is based on that idea of Cassiodorus as to what people should be studying. And by the age of Dante, you have a whole series of very advanced scientific figures in the world of Dante. So Marco Polo has journeyed to China and come back and written a whole book about geography and his trip. A great scientist, Mondino, is going to be doing dissections. Robert Grosseteste in Oxford is doing experimental sciences. Roger Bacon. So by the age of Dante, if you want just a date, 1300, already European universities and European authorities are publishing books that are quite advanced in science. Science in the Middle Ages, does it exist? Yes. Is it scientific? Yes. Does it have rules and regulations for proceeding? Yes. Do they do experiments? Yes. In fact, they are more careful and better recorded in doing experiments than the Greeks were. They have a much more elaborated idea of what a scientific experiment would be, particularly in the 1300s. Now, it's true 12, not quite as much, but certainly in the 1300s, European science, University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, Padua, are very elaborate, very advanced.